Grains and chunks of dust and dirt rained down from overhead as a figure hopped over the cliff and rappelled down the side, a rope tied around his waist. He was a young, wiry, lithe fellow, not much older than Elizabeth. His quick, sure motions were accompanied by the faintest jingle of metal and leather from the tiny daggers he kept sheathed in the bandolier slung about his shoulders. Elizabeth recognized him almost immediately, and could scarcely have been happier to see him.
"Don!"
she sighed, eyes sparkling at the mere sight of him.
"Hey, Eliz,"
he greeted with a smirk.
"Kid's been itching for a field trip, eh? Classroom getting a little stuffy?"
"No," Chrissy blurted out. "We got dragged down by a centipede. Then Miss Hartley fought the monster, and there was a trapdoor spider, and—"
"Slow down, kiddo,"
Don cut her off.
"First, let's get you back on top. Then you can tell us all about it, okay?"
Chrissy paused for a moment, her mouth hanging open mid-sentence before finally nodding.
"You first. I'll be back in a moment for the rest of you."
With that, Don heaved Chrissy into his arms and gave a tug on the rope. At the top of the cliff, the rest of the gatherers, strong, hardy men of the village who ventured into the realms of the great apes for food, hauled the rope back up, slowly raising Don and his new passenger. Not too long after, he returned for Will, and the process repeated. In the meantime, Elizabeth glanced back across the river, half expecting to see a spider, the monster, or some other horror looking back at her. All there was, however, was a dense swarm of gnats swirling about over the water. Somewhere beyond them, Elizabeth thought she saw something move.
"Your turn, Liz."
Don's voice interrupted her thoughts. As Elizabeth turned back, she was greeted with the sight of Don, his arms held wide, and an enormous grin on his face. She hesitated. What would the other mice think, Elizabeth wondered, if Don were to pop over the side of the cliff with her in his arms, like some damsel in distress?
"Or you could just grab the rope,"
Don added, as if reading Elizabeth's mind.
"I'm easy."
It really made no difference, Elizabeth decided. With the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of her mouth, she wrapped her arms around Don's neck and whispered,
"Tug away."
Don froze for just a moment. Elizabeth could picture the look on his face. All the color drained away, eyes wide in shock. For all his flirting, he never expected anything from Elizabeth. This was the first time he had gotten so much as a handshake out of her. The shock, however, wore off quickly. Don patted Elizabeth on the back and gave his rope a final tug. The rope grew taut, and in moments Elizabeth's feet left the ground. As the two slowly ascended the cliffside, Elizabeth spoke up.
"What do you know about the monster?"
"Monster?"
Don repeated.
"Well, I know the old story. A mouse went crazy in the gorge and started hunting spiders and centipede. I'm guessing he got started beefing up on flies. High protein, you know. Aside from that, I'd say I know as much as anyone."
"Today was the first I'd heard of him."
Don half chuckled.
"Really? I heard the story had been going around since before I got here."
Yes, Don was something of a newcomer to Edge of the Gorge. Late one night he appeared out of the dark, drawn by the light of the village fire. He didn't talk much about where he came from, but he quickly proved himself an excellent tracker, and was shortly thereafter recruited as a gatherer. If you'll recall that scout I mentioned earlier, that was Don, running ahead of the other gatherers to search for traps and ambushes, and then returning to divert their caravan or give the all-clear signal. The sounds of wild applause and cheers greeted Don and Elizabeth as they appeared over the side of the cliff. Elizabeth, somewhat red-faced, took a few steps back to join in applauding her hero, only to find that Don was clapping as well. She paused, glancing about her, and found every eye in the crowd fixed quite firmly on her. Elizabeth bit her lip and forced an awkward smile.
3 cheers for the hero?"
"Sounds good to me."
Don barked with a laugh.
"Let's hear it for Elizabeth Hartley. Woo!"
Don resumed clapping and did a little happy dance, which only prompted a crowd full of stares. Somewhere in the distance there came the sound of a cricket playing a low, slow tune on a violin. Elizabeth was speechless. She gazed, wide-eyed, in a circle at the other mice.
"Me? But Don!"
wasn't the one who took on the monster and lived.
Don cut her off. Chrissy and Will have told us what happened, Cole, the father of the children, explained. Unfortunately, their story was a little choppy, another mouse chimed in. Fragmented. Rushed.
There were a few details missing,
Don added.
All we got was centipede, Miss Hartley fought the monster, and something about a trapdoor spider. We were hoping you could shed a little light on it all.
Elizabeth clenched her teeth and forced a grin, hoping to project an air of confidence and strength, but she really just wanted to hide under a rock. She spent a long time trying to pull together a coherent story before finally giving up and heaving a sigh.
Actually, I'm feeling very tired. I'd like to go home if I may.
A fair suggestion,
The old firekeeper squeaked from atop a nearby boulder.
I think we've had quite enough talk of monsters for one evening.
Though the other mice were clearly disappointed, not one of them forced the issue further. Don took Elizabeth by the arm and gently led her away from the crowd.
Come on, let's get you cleaned up.
The bathhouse was a large communal structure, adapted from the remains of a crumbling clay pot. Only half the original pot remained, and that made up the bathhouse's walls and ceiling, with the open end serving as an entrance. The ground inside had been covered over in smooth stones, making for a dry, clean surface. 4 small tables occupied the corners of the chamber, on which sat basins of clean water, which were changed hourly. The main bath would have been no more than an ashtray to the great apes, but for a mouse it served well enough as a shallow pool. Normally it would have had its water changed only once every couple days due to its size. Don, however, took one look at the water and decided it wasn't good enough for Elizabeth.
Just hang on a moment,
he muttered, and promptly tipped the ashtray onto its side, dumping the old water all over the floor. Don then retrieved one of the barrels, which were set aside for just such occasions, and refilled the tray with a fresh load of clean water. Elizabeth blushed.
You didn't have to do that, you know.
Of course I did. The heroine of the hour deserves no less. Besides, I'll just refill the barrel next time we head out.
With that, Don rolled the empty container outside and piled it into the gatherer's cart. In the meantime, Elizabeth shook her cloak from her shoulders and eased herself into the fresh water. It was cold, of course, and normally that would have been fine. After the chill of the stream in the gorge, however, it cut straight to Elizabeth's bones. Still, it felt good to rinse the dust and dirt from her face, and her hair, and fur. It stung as she washed out her cuts and bruises, scratches she hadn't known existed until the water touched them. But it was a cleansing sting, and that made it almost pleasurable. Upon his return, Don brushed off Elizabeth's cloak, cleaning it as best as he could. Alas, he wasn't exactly a homemaker, and domestic skills such as the wash were beyond him. When he was done, he hung the cloak from a nearby hook, and slipped into the water as well. Don, unlike Elizabeth, was hot from his day's work. He had also taken his life into his hands, but unlike Elizabeth, Don had been running and hopping about in fields and on sunny hillsides. The cold water felt good to Don. After a time, he sat back with a sigh and glanced over to Elizabeth.
So, what exactly did happen? You got me curious.
Elizabeth rubbed her shoulders, shaking.
Can we go somewhere warm first? Like the fire?
She hopped out of the ashtray onto the rocky floor and shook like a wet dog, sending water droplets flying in all directions. Don shrugged and splashed his face a final time.
As you wish.
Reluctantly, he stood up, stretched, and slunk out onto the ground. Before leaving, Elizabeth rinsed out her cloak in the fresh water, giving it a much more thorough cleaning than Don had managed. She then wrung it out and draped it over her arm to dry. As Elizabeth huddled close to Don by the fire, the whole story came tumbling out. From Will scaring Chrissy with his tall tales, to the centipede, the monster, the spider, and finally to Don's rescue of the 3 from the gorge. Don chuckled as Elizabeth described his rescue.
I was just an elevator, Liz. It sounds to me like you did all the rescuing today.
Elizabeth shook her head.
I'm not so sure about that. I thought the monster was, well, going to harm the children, but when he threw that halberd, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. What were the chances that it just happened to save them from something else?
Don shrugged.
Well, he was choking at the time. Maybe his aim was off?
Maybe.
Elizabeth folded her hands and rubbed her chin along her knuckles as she gazed into the fire.
But have we heard any stories of this monster actually killing someone?
Oh, of course not.
Don laughed.
The ones he killed aren't talking.
He isn't a monster,
the firekeeper interrupted. Having returned to his post, he heard the entire conversation.
I would greatly appreciate it if people would stop referring to him as such. He was one of us once. Pity no one remembered that, even when he still was.
Did you know him?
Elizabeth asked.
Aye,
the firekeeper croaked. He sat down on a nearby bench, his walking stick leaning against his shoulder.
And so did you. So did we all. Well, except for you, maybe.
At this, he gestured towards Don.
Little Jeremiah Marsh disappeared long before you showed up.
Elizabeth silently repeated the name to herself and shook her head.
I don't remember. Sorry.
I'm not surprised. You were just a wee lass at the time, not much older than Jerry himself.
All at once, Elizabeth's face lit up.
Jerry?
She gasped.
I do remember a Jerry. He was a runt, right?
Aye.
The firekeeper leaned back and lit up a little pipe.
I'm glad to see someone remembers him as he was.
Elizabeth smiled ruefully into the flames.
He was very odd. But Jerry was a good friend of mine.
You never understood a word he said, but you helped him drink his wine.
Elizabeth and the firekeeper gazed back at Don, their faces more annoyed than amused.
He wasn't a bullfrog, was he?
The cold stares of his companions turned Don's face a bright shade of red, which shone even through his thick fur.
It's a song. Get it?
Elizabeth turned back to the firekeeper.
So, what happened to him? All I can remember is that he was there one day, and then I never heard from him again.
The firekeeper grimaced and inched towards the flames.
I blame his mother. Even at her best, Maud Marsh was not fit to bear children.
Mad Maud?
Don piped up.
She was a witch or something, wasn't she?
Again, two cold sets of eyes fixated on Don.
What? That's just what I've heard.
The firekeeper shrugged.
Mayhap she was, mayhap she wasn't. She was quite mad, I'll grant, hardly a model of civil behaviour. From the moment he could walk, Jeremiah had to be father to his own mother. Always sick and bedridden she was. I blame that brew she kept drinking to stave off the cold. But if only for Jeremiah's sake, I'll not hear anyone give her smart-alecky nicknames.
The firekeeper shivered and rubbed his arms. Elizabeth rose to her feet and wrapped her cloak about the old mouse's shoulders. By now it had grown dry and was quite warm. The firekeeper patted her hand gratefully.
Bless you, lass. Bless you.
Heaving a sigh, he went on.
That woman could wail something fierce. I tell you, even a banshee'd cower when she got started. I can't say what happened under their roof, but I can imagine. Jeremiah was a jumpy lad.
So he ran away from home, started hunting spiders, and turned into a fierce barbarian, and the legend was born?
Don guessed.
No,
the firekeeper scoffed.
Jeremiah was a good lad. He stuck by his mother till the day she died, even a wailing and hollering as she went.
His mother would protect him,
Elizabeth explained.
I once saw her chase away several older boys that had been picking on him.
Don snapped his fingers, and Elizabeth could nearly see the light bulb appear over his head.
So his mother died, and there was no one left to look out for this odd little boy, and then he ran away from home, and...
Aye, that's the short of it.
Elizabeth's head snapped back in Don's direction, a look of intense determination on her face.
No,
Don answered.
No, I No, that look. Don't give me that look. I just got back from an expedition, and I don't want to come home to that look.
No one said you had to come with me,
Elizabeth answered tersely.
What do you mean? Of course I'm coming with you.
Don exclaimed.
You don't think I'm letting you dive into the gorge on your own, do you? Someone's got to watch your back.
Take this, then,
the firekeeper added. He drew the cloak from his shoulders and held it out for Elizabeth.
You'll need it more than I.
Don rubbed his aching forehead.
Can't we at least wait for morning? It's getting dark. The spiders will be crawling out to hunt, and didn't you say you were tired?
Indeed she was. Elizabeth could be impetuous at times, and sometimes her excitement got to her head. This was one of those times, and as Don brought her back down to earth, she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Elizabeth heaved a sigh and nodded. Don hopped to his feet and ushered Elizabeth away from the fire.
Come on, then. Let's get you home before you decide to save the whales.
Elizabeth clambered into the gatherer's wagon, while Don called back the 2 grasshoppers which had been grazing nearby and hitched them up. He then joined Elizabeth in the wagon and gave the reins a good shake. The grasshoppers' legs dug in, and ever so slowly the wagon began to roll forward. In short order, Elizabeth and Don were off.
So you're sure about this?
Don asked.
Yes.
He'll be ready for you this time.
I'm not looking for a fight.
But he might be.
That's a chance I'll have to take.
Yeah, about that. I'd really prefer you don't.
Jerry's been alone for too long. He deserves a chance to come home.
Right. Can't really argue with that.
I'm glad you see it that way.
I'm not.
Don drew back on the reins as the grasshoppers bounded up to the schoolhouse. Bit by bit, the wagon ground to a halt. Elizabeth hopped down, patting the grasshoppers' heads as she passed. The insects chirped warmly in response. Don, meanwhile, heaved a crate over his shoulder. On the side, marked in white chalk, was the name E. Hartley, Elizabeth's share of the food gathered during the prior week.
Chow call, Liz,
he shouted after her.
Where'd you like it?
Elizabeth paused at the entrance to the schoolhouse. After all the excitement, she had forgotten there would be a delivery that day.
This way, sorry.
Elizabeth drew the curtain back, allowing Don in. He swaggered past the various desks and thimble stools with the faintest of chuckles, the confidence returning to his steps in spades.
In the back, then?
Yes, thank you.
Just wait till I tell the boys. Elizabeth Hartley invited me into her apartment.
Don, you wouldn't.
Of course, she wasn't there at the time.
Don continued with a sly wink.
But still, it counts for something, right?
He paused just a moment to let his words hang in the air, and then laughed and added,
I'm just pulling my leg, Liz.
Elizabeth managed a faint smile, though once again she wished she could crawl under a rock.
Don't you mean you're pulling my leg?
Nah, any man that thinks he could bet a fine lady like you is only kidding himself.
With that, Don vanished behind the curtain at the far end of the schoolhouse, stacked the crate against the back wall, and retrieved the previous, now quite empty crate that had been there. His job done for the night, Don clambered back into the wagon, setting aside the empty crate for a future refill.
Oh yeah, I left a little something extra in your box. Compliments of the delivery boy. Me.
Oh, Don, you shouldn't have.
It's no big deal. I'll just take it out of my own share.
Don, you're going to spoil me.
Ha! Not as long as you keep telling me not to, I won't.
Don drew the reins sharply to his right, prompting the grasshoppers to bring the wagon around and set off for the village.
See you in the morning, Liz. Good night.
Elizabeth waved after Don, bidding him a fond, silent farewell. Once he had vanished around the bend, Elizabeth retreated into the schoolhouse and hung up her cloak on a handy hook. Now, you know how when you were a kid, you always thought your teachers actually lived at the school? Like, maybe they slept on top of their desk, or retreated into a locker with their arms crossed over their chests with a clump of dirt from their native land? Yeah, your teachers didn't, but Elizabeth Hartley did. The walls of the schoolhouse were lined with shelves, piled high with books. the public collection, which Elizabeth made available to her students and their families. Behind her desk, a ragged cloth hung over a narrow opening between the public shelves. As Elizabeth ventured to the back of the schoolhouse, she slipped behind this cloth into that apartment you've heard such tell of. Here she kept her private collection, piled on shelves mounted as high as the ceiling, with only enough of an opening for her bed. These were books unsuitable for her students, whether the language was too advanced, the subject matter something above their heads, or the content simply improper for a young audience. Tales of romance and intrigue, murder and mayhem, the erotic and the horrific. Tonight, however, she had something new to read, a note left on the new crate of food.
To my hero,
Elizabeth read, a warm feeling coming over her as she saw the signature.
Donald Copper.
She pried open the crate's lid. Inside were the usual shares of food, neatly sorted and packed away in little parcels, and on top, as promised, a little something extra. Elizabeth carefully unwrapped the package and sighed, shaking her head. Inside was a hunk of cheese, large as a rat's fist.
Oh, Don, really?
Elizabeth paused, glancing back at the curtain, and then peered out into the empty schoolhouse. Without any further hesitation, she eagerly stuffed the whole blasted thing into her mouth.
If this keeps up, you'll make me fat.
Yes, Elizabeth had quite the voracious appetite. To her credit, though, necessity forced her to keep it in check, a task that she always succeeded at, and tonight was no exception. It really was only the extra tidbits Don brought her that allowed Elizabeth to let go of herself, and even that only went so far. The following morning began with business as usual. Elizabeth, guided by some inner sense, slunk reluctantly out of bed with the rising of the sun, scattering the books piled on her chest from the prior night's reading. Each one was gathered up, checked for damage, and returned to its place on the shelf. Elizabeth followed this up with a light half-meal of a breakfast. There was additional business that day after her classes ended, quite terrifying business, in fact, which left her normally formidable appetite greatly weakened. A squirt of water from the spray bottle in the opposite corner to rinse out her teeth and wash the sleep from her eyes concluded Elizabeth's morning routine. Elizabeth took a seat at her desk and went over her notes for the day's lessons while she waited for her class to congregate.
So, yesterday concluded with our founding,
Elizabeth muttered to herself.
So the next major event would have been...
And from that, each additional topic of the day was drawn. This event involved this thing and that predator and that principle. She looked up at the sound of the first arrival and then raised a curious eyebrow.
Don?
Morning, Liz.
Don greeted and slouched against the wall.
Aren't you a little early? I still have classes to...
Yeah, about that. I'm afraid I've got some bad news. And some good news. Mostly bad, though.
The worst of possibilities flashed through Elizabeth's mind. There was a sudden slap of paper as she slammed her journal closed, running both hands through her hair.
Another child hasn't...
What?
Don squinted, quite taken aback.
No, the kids are fine. Nothing like that. People are concerned, is all, about yesterday's incident. The mayor called a meeting to talk over precautions.
Oh.
Elizabeth paused.
Well, I can think of a few things off the top of my head. I could bring materials directly into the village. It wouldn't be as convenient.
There's also talk of finding a new school arm.
What?
Hey, I'm just the messenger boy. But I'm sorry you had to hear it from me.
No, it's all right.
Elizabeth looked at the ground and rubbed her forehead.
I'm glad it was you.
Looking up, she asked,
So, what's the good news?
Don forced a grin.
You get to see my pretty face first thing in the morning.
He batted his eyes for emphasis. Elizabeth couldn't help laughing. Don gave her a moment, and then abruptly wiped the smile from his face.
Now, come on. Someone has to speak up for you, and my word doesn't carry much weight.
The two mice raced out of the schoolhouse, Elizabeth nearly forgetting her cloak in the rush. By the time they arrived in town, proceedings were already winding down. The general consensus had been that, due to Elizabeth's inability to guarantee the children's safety, the responsibility of instructing the village youths was to be passed to a slightly less satisfactory, but much more trustworthy subject. Bubba, a semi-literate woodsman whose qualifications consisted solely of owning the only other book in town, that being the tattered remains of the M to S volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he had up to now been using to prop up the corner of his kitchen table.
"We're too late,"
Elizabeth gasped. She stared dumbfounded at the mice around her as they dispersed, less than a handful even aware that she had arrived. She hung her head in shame and despair.
"They've made their decision."
Don, on the other hand, was glaring with laser-like intensity into the mayor's back.
Then we'll go over their heads. Come on.
He took Elizabeth by the hand and roughly hauled her after him as he made a beeline for the mayor.
"Over there,"
Elizabeth sputtered.
"we can't do that. These are their children we're talking about. We can't force a decision without their input."
Sure we can. They forced one without you.
"But these aren't my children. I'm just..."
Don came to a sudden stop and whirled about to face Elizabeth.
You care about the kids too, right?
"Well, yes."
And you want them to learn from a good teacher, right?
"Well, yes."
And does this Bubba character really sound like the educating type to you?
Elizabeth paused. Don's rationale was sound, but there was still something bothering her. The very thing that had started the whole mess to begin with.
"The path, though, it's..."
Not going to be an issue.
Don assured her.
Weren't you the one saying you could bring your stuff to the village? Cut out the dangerous part?
Elizabeth didn't answer. Don didn't wait for an answer either.
You, Liz, are going to have a chance to present your case, even if I have to do it for you.
Don released Elizabeth's hand and affectionately patted her on the cheek. Then the two were off again, this time Elizabeth running freely beside Don.
"Mr. Mayor, sir?"
was Elizabeth's call as she and Don bounded up behind him. The immediate answer was a disgusted groan. The mayor was not, typically, a busy mouse. One might have said he was deliberately out of touch. He rarely had a clue what was going on in town, and he liked it that way. The mayor wasn't generally needed, save for a handful of public moments like recording births, officiating marriages, and occasionally christening a ship. Being that the mice did not live near water, however, that was extremely rare. Most of his time, to be frank, was spent hiding away in his office, either sleeping or pretending his pencils were little rocket ships. As such, the morning had been far too busy for the mayor's taste. Having arrived at what his constituents appeared to consider a reasonable conclusion, the mayor considered the day's work finished, and just wanted to crawl back into bed. The mayor made no attempt at pleasantries as he turned around. He wore his annoyance like a mask, projecting every unpleasant thought on his mind as strongly as his face could manage.
Yeah? What is it?
His mouth briefly twisted into a fake smile before sagging into an irritated frown.
Good morning, by the way. Bah!
Elizabeth, quite understandably, was struck speechless.
"Oh, well, I'm Elizabeth Hartley."
Right. We just fired you, right? Congratulations. You're promoted to customer. Good day.
The mayor turned to leave. Elizabeth would likely have let the matter drop, then and there. Don, however, was more persistent. He darted ahead of the mayor, chattering furiously as he kept his pace with the retreating mouse.
Thing is, your officialness, Elizabeth wasn't aware her position was in question. Just the other night, everyone was hailing her as a hero.
The mayor answered without so much as breaking stride.
Yes, the people are fickle. One moment they want this, the next they want that. It's why I let them do everything themselves.
And a wise policy that is,
Don interjected.
There's just one little problem. My good friend, back there, didn't have a chance to defend herself. She didn't even know there was a meeting.
Well, that's the chance one takes, living out of town. Good day.
Which is exactly why we're here now.
The mayor drew to an abrupt halt with a frustrated sigh. Turning to face Don, he growled.
I, for one, don't much care who teaches the children, or where. It could be a clown standing on his head and juggling nuts with his feet, while he recites every lesson in rhyme, at a cat convention at that. I'm sorry for Mrs. Hartley, but if she has a problem with the decision, let her take it up with the people who made it. Now, for the last time, good day.
With that, the mayor scampered off into his residence and slammed his door shut, closing and locking all 5 latches, and said no more. Don stared at the door for a time, rubbing his chin in thought.
Now I remember why I didn't vote for him.
Don's face was especially grim as he turned back and stalked down the short path leading down to the village square. Elizabeth didn't need to ask how things had turned out.
More bad news?
She guessed. Don shrugged.
Some good, some bad.
What could possibly be good about this?
Don flashed a sly grin.
You and me get a day off together.
Heh.
Elizabeth let out a half-hearted laugh.
It may be more than a day, for me.
It's not that bad.
Don gave her a reassuring pat on the back.
The next step is to go see Bubba. He's in way over his head. The way I figure it, he'll welcome a hand from someone more prepared for the job.
Elizabeth gazed hopefully into Don's eyes.
You think?
Don winked back.
I know.
Elizabeth stopped and turned aside to gaze out over the gorge.
Do you think Jerry had to put up with this kind of thing?
Every day, from what I hear.
Elizabeth let out a short breath.
No wonder he went crazy.
Looking back at Don, she added,
Well, I guess I don't have to be anywhere today.
Don opened his mouth, fully intending to say,
Neither do I.
but then stopped short.
Liz, are you going to say what I think you're going to say?
We've been through this.
Okay.
I doubt the spiders will be active at this hour.
You're right, of course.
Don had actually hoped the morning's events might have made Elizabeth forget her personal mission. Far from it, it all only served to embolden her. With no responsibilities to hold her back, Elizabeth could afford to go crusading all throughout the gorge and into the unknown lands beyond. Yes, she regretted losing her position. Yes, she would miss the children. But now she also had all the time in the world on her hands.
Well,
Elizabeth mused, her face suddenly lighting up.
what are we waiting for then?
Lunch?
Oh, I just ate.
Elizabeth paused in thought and then added,
But if you're hungry, I'll gladly join you.
Fine.
Don grumbled.
I'll meet you by the fire.
It's a date then.
Elizabeth gave Don a quick peck on the cheek and bounded away, an energized, quite endearing spring in her step. Under any other circumstances, the village could have been on fire or under attack by a cat, Don would have been ecstatic to receive such affection from Elizabeth. As it was, however, he just felt sick.
I've created a Frankenstein.
Well, there was nothing more to do about it. Elizabeth's mind was quite made up, and Don could either follow along to keep her out of trouble, or he could let his special woman wing it on her own, against who knew what perils. So Don scampered off to the gatherer's barracks, and collected his gear. A longbow, a quiver of arrows, his bandolier slotted with its multitude of daggers, a coil of rope, and enough rations to keep him eating lightly for a day. Don returned to the fire, as agreed, to find Elizabeth already waiting, nibbling at a crust of bread. He had to give her credit. Elizabeth knew enough to keep light on her feet before walking into a danger zone. Don did, however, have one concern.
Not packing anything to eat?
He raised a cautious eyebrow.
Where we're headed, you'll need to keep up your strength.
I don't think we're going to be out that long.
Elizabeth answered.
We'll hop in, grab Jerry, and hop back out again, huh?
Don shook his head.
Liz, this isn't going to be a rescue operation. It's going to be a hunting trip. We're searching for someone that might not want to be found.
Despite being quite full, Elizabeth felt her stomach growl at the suggestion of an extended venture without regular meals. Apparently it was loud enough for Don to hear, because his gaze was immediately drawn to Elizabeth's navel. She grinned sheepishly.
You may be right.
Without further argument, Elizabeth rushed back to the old schoolhouse. While she packed a small wicker basket with carefully portioned foodstuffs, Dawn patrolled the cliffs at the edge of the gorge, scouting for a proper anchor to secure one end of the rope. A large stone, perhaps, or a small tree stump would have sufficed. He eventually settled on a large, sturdy toadstool, roughly halfway between the village and schoolhouse. The sun was high in the sky when Elizabeth met up with Dawn again. The climb down was far quicker and far less dramatic than Elizabeth's descent the prior evening. In no time at all, she and Dawn stood side by side, gazing out over the rocky ground, and the splash of the shallow stream ringing in their ears. Dawn poked at the nearby ground, searching for odd cracks or changes in texture and consistency, signs of spider dens hidden alongside the stones. Elizabeth, however, was not quite so cautious.
Jeremiah Marsh!
She called out, sending Dawn nearly flying out of his skin.
Jerry!
Dawn gestured furiously for her to be quiet.
You want everything in the gorge to know where we are?
Elizabeth clapped her hands over her mouth, her face turning a bright shade of scarlet. Both mice eyed the ground around them. There were no telltale movements of spiders lurking beneath, readying to pounce. Somewhere to the left, there came a faint sound of disturbed pebbles and crumbling soil. Dawn motioned for Elizabeth to follow. Quick and light, he crept towards the stream, eyes and nose twitching at even the slightest irregularity in the ground. Every crack, every shift in texture could mark a trapdoor leading into a spider's den. Such spiders, when in motion, could easily ensnare and drag a mouse into their lairs within a fraction of a second. The only defense was to be wary and spot the entrances before approaching. Dawn and Elizabeth waded across the stream together to cut off the trail they left behind. Looking back, Elizabeth could make out some movement among the rocks, the faintest of shifting motions. The thing, whatever it was, followed the path left by the mice right up to the water's edge before it grew still.
And that's why we keep our voices down,
Dawn explained.
Got it?
Elizabeth nodded.
Good. Stay close.
Dawn straightened up and scanned his surroundings once more. Elizabeth followed his every gaze, trying to see whatever it was he saw, and possibly a few things he might not have. A heavy silence had fallen over the gorge. The swarm of gnats no longer swirled above the stream, and the air had grown still and oppressive, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Dawn stepped cautiously in the direction of the village, retreating towards the known end of the gorge.
I'm just eliminating the obvious,
he explained.
Just to be sure that is, Jerry, isn't at our backs.
Elizabeth followed in silence, often looking over her shoulder as if to catch some phantom trailing after them. Many times she caught Dawn doing the same, for he, too, was concerned about what might be following them. Even if the monster was ahead, there were many other, far less savory, things in the gorge that might be creeping along behind. The sun had reached its apex when Elizabeth spotted the first sign of a mouse's passing, in the form of a circle of sheltering stones, similar to a bird's nest.
I remember this spot,
she announced, albeit in a hushed tone.
When you rescued us the other day, I saw him crouched right here, watching us. Then he just disappeared.
Dawn sniffed at the shelter and nearly gagged. It stank of urine and feces.
This explains where he disappeared too. And since I didn't catch a whiff of this stench on the way over...
He might still be nearby,
Elizabeth reasoned.
Assuming he didn't wash the smell off in the stream, maybe.
Dawn agreed. He crouched down near the nest and nosed around the surrounding pebbles. He caught a whiff of a trail and followed it a number of paces up the valley. Then he froze, his eyes fixed on a narrow, barely visible hairline crack in the ground.
What is it?
Elizabeth whispered, creeping after Dawn. He held up a hand, gesturing for her to stop.
Stay back. It's a spider's den.
Elizabeth's first impulse was to freeze. Her second was to leap back. She conquered both impulses, however, and instead crept backwards as slowly as she had approached. Dawn, on the other hand, attempted to provoke the first move. Very slowly, very quietly, he drew an arrow from his quiver and pulled his bowstring taut, with the faintest groan drawn from the longbow's frame. He aimed dead center of the crack and let the arrow fly. It shot like a thread through the eye of a needle, straight down the crack and into the black depths. Somewhere deep inside there came a sound of the arrow clattering harmlessly to the ground. He looked over his shoulder and whispered,
"Whatever you do, wherever you find yourself, never do this."
Before Elizabeth could ask what Don meant, he was in motion, creeping softly towards the crack, and, drawing a dagger, he pried the entrance open. Bits of webbing and clods of dirt shook loose as the trapdoor opened, and the light of the midday sun shone inside. Don flinched and gasped in shock for a moment. Directly on the other side, staring up at him, were the black, unblinking, orb-like eyes of a truly immense spider. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped as she waited for one of them, Don or the spider, to make a move. Don glanced back to Elizabeth and grinned.
"It's okay. It's dead."
As Elizabeth approached, she could make out the end of Don's arrow lodged firmly between the spider's fangs, likely embedded in the back of its throat.
Amazing shot.
Don shook his head.
"Judging by the smell, I'd say this critter was dead long before we came by."
Peering closer, he added,
"My guess is it must have been that gash in her chest that did her in."
As Elizabeth looked closer, she could see what Don was talking about. There was, indeed, an enormous tear in the spider's exoskeleton, dead center of its legs. Don smirked.
"You know, I always thought a spider of this size would be juicier."
Unless it was sucked dry.
Elizabeth added.
Right after he killed the centipede, I saw him rip open its armor and drink.
Don shivered at the thought.
"And this is the guy we're trying to find?"
And bring home. Yes.
Yet even as she said it, Elizabeth felt her convictions waver. Don could see it in her face. With a shrug, he let the trapdoor fall closed.
"Well, at least we haven't heard about him doing this kind of thing to other mice, right?"
Don, are you trying to reassure me?
Don shook his head.
"Nope. I'm trying to reassure me."
Elizabeth gazed ahead, taking in the scene. 2 opposing cliffs, 2 shores, and between cliff and shore, broad stretches of flat, rocky ground. It was all very unremarkable.
I don't see him here now.
"And we didn't see his nest the other day,"
Don added.
"He might still be hiding around here."
He paused a moment and thought. Then he cupped his hands alongside his mouth and called out,
"Jeremiah Marsh!"
He waited in silence, his voice echoing off the walls of the gorge.
What are you doing?
Elizabeth whispered in alarm.
Didn't you say...
"He was here yesterday,"
Don explained.
"There's a dead spider here today, and it's quiet, like everything's afraid to move. So, what are they afraid of?"
Elizabeth's eyes widened. Somewhere not much further away, another crack appeared in the ground. She gave a shout as if to encourage what was emerging.
Jerry!
But instead of a white hand gripping a steel halberd, followed by the rippling muscle of the monster's arm and shoulders, there came instead a black, shining limb, like polished obsidian, and a multitude of gleaming black eyes.
"Get back!"
Don managed to shout, just as the spider rushed out. It bowled him over effortlessly, leaving Don prone. Out came the fangs, plunging for the kill. They were met with a pair of daggers, driving the fangs apart to dig harmlessly into the ground. With a shriek, the disoriented spider lurched upwards, fangs flapping wildly as they shook off the chunks of stone. In an instant, Don was back on his feet, just as the spider charged again. With a great leap, he lunged past the fangs, both daggers burying themselves squarely in the spider's foremost eyes. Don hopped backwards as the spider recoiled in pain, landing squarely on his feet. His hand rushed for the longbow, the other drawing an arrow. Before the spider could react, Don was ready to fire, but he never did. A scream rocked the sides of the gorge. The spider didn't even consider returning to its den. It wheeled away, scurrying for the stream, its multitude of limbs churning the water as it ran. On the other side, something shifted among the stones, and the spider simply stopped.
This is just a guess,
Don whispered.
but we may want to take cover.
He rushed for the dead spider's lair, pulling Elizabeth with him as he passed. She, however, was still looking back at what it was. The spider rose unnaturally on its legs, far higher than their frame and shape should have allowed. Soon the legs curled up beneath it, revealing a giant steel blade embedded in its chest, and the metal pole supporting it.
It's Jerry!
Elizabeth shouted. Don ground to a halt and looked back, his mouth falling agape as he laid eyes on the hulking mouse across the stream. The spider fell with a resounding crash, landing on its back, a gargantuan white hairless mouse riding it to the ground. This time, however, the monster of the gorge didn't stop to feed. He wrenched his weapon free and turned his gaze to the mice watching him.
Now I know why they call him a monster,
Don breathed.
Quick, let's get out of here.
Yet as Don moved to run, he could feel Elizabeth resisting.
No! This is who we've been looking for.
Across the stream, the monster gave another howl and broke into a tripedal charge, his right arm holding the halberd out to the side.
Well, we were wrong. He looks perfectly happy here. Let's give him his space, a whole lot of space.
The water foamed as the monster tore across the stream, jagged, chipped teeth flashing in the sunlight. Elizabeth wrenched her hand free of Don's grip, choosing instead to stand her ground.
I won't ask you to stay.
A threatening swipe of the halberd's blade sent chunks of rock and dirt flying as the monster closed in, a third shriek thundering forth from his mouth.
I don't believe I'm doing this.
Don darted between Elizabeth and the monster, letting an arrow fly straight for the monster's chest. The formidable mouse, however, ducked aside, snatching the arrow out of the air mid-flight with reflexes that would have put a spider to shame. Elizabeth pressed a hand against Don's chest, forcing him behind her as she stepped forward to meet the charging monster.
Jeremiah Marsh!
She called. The monster didn't even slow.
Jerry!
The halberd swept forward and came crashing down with the speed and might of a stroke of lightning. A dizzying wave swept over Elizabeth. She gasped for breath and felt somewhat unsteady on her feet. Directly in front of her there was now a deep trench where the halberd had split the ground apart. A blast of putrid wind rushed into Elizabeth's face as the monster roared with all his might.
Jerry!
Elizabeth spoke again, softly this time.
It's me. It's Elizabeth.
She was met with the cold steel of the halberd's blade, pressing against her throat, threatening to lift her off her feet by her chin.
Don't you remember me, Jerry?
The monster's brow furrowed. Steam blew from his nostrils.
I was your friend once.
Saliva dripped from the monster's jaws as he bared his teeth.
We grew up together.
The monster's knuckles grew even whiter as his grip tightened about his weapon.
And I've come to bring you home.
Elizabeth didn't so much as blink as she locked eyes with the monster. Then she gave him her famous stare. As you may recall, there were stories about Elizabeth as well. The monster's eyes widened as he met Elizabeth's gaze head-on.
Home.
You don't have to be alone anymore.
I am not alone.
The head of the halberd dropped from Elizabeth's throat. It swung about in a broad ellipse and came to a rest, with the haft struck firmly into the ground.
And I am already home.
Elizabeth gulped as she felt the monster's eyes turn her own gaze back upon her. The monster slouched back on his haunches and leaned forward, arm outstretched as if he were hanging from the halberd's shaft.
I remember you. You with the children.
Elizabeth took a tentative step forward.
And before that?
The monster lurched forward with a snarl, sending Elizabeth scurrying backwards.
Before that, I buried Jeremiah. He is dead, and his memories with him. I am monster!
Elizabeth's heart might have sunk had she believed her ears.
How did he die?
The monster didn't answer. He rose to his feet, taking the halberd in both hands.
Twice now you have defeated me. So go, tell the others of your adventures. Play the conquering hero, but be sure you warn them. My weapon hungers.
The monster backed away, steadily retreating towards the stream.
This is my land, my home. I will not hesitate to defend it.
The monster threw back his head for a final howl and dashed into the water, vanishing downstream in a rush of foam and spray. Now Elizabeth's heart did sink. She shook her head sadly as she watched the stream settle back into stillness.
He's afraid,
She concluded.
he really is afraid.
A low thud brought Elizabeth back to the moment. She turned around to find Don quite horizontal on the ground behind her, his feet held aloft and his half-open eyes rolled back. Elizabeth knelt down beside him, cradling Don's head in one arm, while she gently shook his shoulders with her free hand.
Wake up. He's gone. It's okay.
Don mumbled something under his breath. His eyes closed and he shook his head. Elizabeth stroked Don's forehead.
We can go back now.
In an instant, Don's eyes snapped open, and he hopped to his feet, stretching and groaning with satisfaction as if having just completed a fine workout.
Well, that was exciting. What an adventure. I can't wait to get home and tell the guys about this.
You mean about how you fainted?
Except for that part.
Just as quickly as the energy had returned to him, all the color drained from Don's face.
You
He whirled around to face Elizabeth.
did not just...
Don, are you all right?
Don forced a grin, but his slight swaying motions betrayed the start of another faint coming on.
Oh, I'm fine, just fine. You were fine too. You just...
His face turned a bright shade of red, and Elizabeth could easily picture jets of steam blowing out his ears. Don's eyes crossed as he rocked back and forth on his heels.
You just stared down the monster of the gorge. Wait till I tell the guys about this.
Don, you should sit down.
Yeah, sure. Don should sit down.
He laughed aloud at his own pun. Elizabeth gaped in horror as Don began to fall again. Quick as a flash, she darted behind him and caught Don under the arms.
You need to get a hold of yourself.
Don.
Don chuckled, wrapping his arms about his shoulders as if he were in a straitjacket.
Or should I say, Don? Haha, I'm rolling.
Elizabeth grabbed Don by the cheeks and forced him to look her way.
Don, we are still in the gorge. We are still in danger. We still need to be quiet.
Don paused a moment, furrowing his brow.
Oh, yeah.
Elizabeth sighed, and after a moment of thought she spoke up.
Wait here.
She drew a small cup from her basket and rushed to the edge of the stream. The water was ice cold, exactly what she needed.
I'm sorry, Don, but I need you back to your senses.
She filled the cup, and returning to Don's side, flung the frigid water in his face. Don gave a yelp of shock and spluttered for a moment as he wiped the water from his eyes. He sat back and heaved a sigh, blinking in the afternoon sun. Elizabeth watched him patiently as Don appeared to calm down.
Are you okay now?
Don nodded.
I think so. Nothing like crossing paths with a legend to give you a rush.
Can you walk?
Don looked up, raising a skeptical eyebrow.
Yeah. Of course I can walk.
Yet as he stood up, his legs wobbled like jello.
That is, I will be able to walk. Soon, I just need to stretch my legs and get my land legs back. And...
Elizabeth caught Don under the arms, helping him to remain upright. Don grimaced sheepishly at her.
Have I told you you're the best girlfriend ever?
Elizabeth grimaced.
That's not exactly how I want to be described.
Finest lady, then.
That's better.
So, one tale ended. No, the monster did not return to Edge of the Gorge. Yes, Elizabeth and her beau did return home safely. Taking Don's advice, Elizabeth did indeed go to meet with Bubba, who, as predicted, was quite grateful for the support. Don, for his part, told many grand stories around the village fire that night, the majority of which centered around his favorite woman. Not that any of it mattered, of course. You see, anything can happen at any time. Edge of the Gorge was in its twilight days. I am very sorry to bring you the bad news, but that little village would not see another sunrise.